Hello and welcome and good afternoon, and thank you for joining the National Conference of State Legislators and the Pew Charitable Trusts for this webinar. It's entitled Public Pension Management Tools in Action, and it's Part 1, Economic Scenario Modeling and Stress Testing in the Time of COVID-19. My name is Representative Mike Tobash, and I'm a state representative from Pennsylvania. And I'll be moderating today's webinar. I currently serve on a few committees here in the state of Pennsylvania: Education, Game and Fisheries, Insurance, and Liquor Control. And I recently chaired the Pennsylvania's commission. It's the Public Pension Management and Asset Investment Review Commission. I worked extensively on reforming Pennsylvania's underfunded public pension system over the last 8 years. I did introduce in 2016 House Bill 1499, which was a hybrid side-by-side pension plan design change. And we, in fact, enacted a law. It was not my bill, but it was Senate Bill 1. That's a side-by-side pension design change. The bill back in 2016 was very aggressive as far as costs go, and we estimated savings between $11 and $15 billion. I'm also a registered investment advisor. I served on the board of the Public Employees Retirement Commission, and we were in that commission was tasked with overseeing the reporting functions of our 3,200 municipal pension plans here in the state of Pennsylvania. So we got a lot of little plans out there. Also issuing actuarial notes on any pension legislation that came before the legislature. Just to tell you a little bit more about the National Conference of Legislatures, and we're pleased to be partnering with the Pew Charitable Trust to bring this webinar to you. In case you're not familiar with NCSL, it's a bipartisan organization that serves the legislators and legislative staffs of the nation's 50 states, its commonwealths and territories. NCSL provides research, testimony, and opportunities for lawmakers to exchange ideas on pressing state policy issues. This event is actually the first event in NCSL's 5-part fall fiscal webinar series. Important, very important right now. And they are on budgets, taxes, and pensions. And in fact, they have it titled Budgets, Taxes, and Pensions, Oh My. The 4 remaining webinars will be held at this time on Thursdays between now and November 19th. For more information on NCSL's meetings, activities, and services to legislators and legislative staff, please visit the website at www.ncsl.org. We have an audience chat box on the lower left-hand side of your screen that we encourage you to use. In fact, to get comfortable with it, we'd love for you to type which state you are viewing from. We have set aside some time later in the webinar to respond to audience questions. A video recording of the event will be made available on NCSL's website later in the week. You'll find a PDF version of our presenter's PowerPoint slides available in the Resources tab on the screen. The purpose of this jointly sponsored webinar is to learn about the initial effects of the global pandemic on the national economy, state finances, and public pensions. We all explore options for responding with a focus on tools like stress testing during downturns to help states make sound decisions and navigate future budgets. We have an outstanding lineup of speakers today. We'll hear from experts from the Pew Charitable Trust as they provide some insight into the current economic climate and explain how tools like stress testing can help policymakers understand, manage, and plan for risk and cost uncertainty in providing and funding pension benefits. We'll also learn from a respected actuary, that's Joe Newton, about the types of questions stress testing can answer and what policymakers should be asking their pension plan administrators and plan actuaries during a downturn. Finally, I will share a bit of our experience in Pennsylvania. Before we do that, I'll just tell you briefly where we've come from. In the year 2000, so 20 years ago, Pennsylvania stood at being 116% funded, and I looked at a recent report, and no state is 116% funded, although there's one or two that are 100% funded. In the year 2001, we passed a bill, Act 9. I was not a member of the General Assembly at that time, but our funded status exceeded 115%. But that law enacted retroactive benefit increases and shortened the vesting requirements. Right after that, we passed Act 30 that put caps on employer contributions that they'd be no longer than 1.5%. So with the surplus in our pension plan, the legislator acted to increase benefits and make them more generous, and that caused an avalanche. And later in 2010, the legislature, again, before I got there, I was elected in 2010, started service in 2011, reset the benefit design to pre-Act 9, and they established a payment schedule. However, caps remained in place, and they did not increase the contributions to more than 4.5% in any year until we got up to paying the required contribution rate. Act 5 of 2017 established that new hybrid plan that I talked about, and currently Pennsylvania stands at being 55% funded, only 55% funded, about $60 billion in unfunded liability. Our contribution rate right now is about 34% of payroll, and we face market uncertainty as everyone does in the country. So with that said, we've got a great lineup here, and I'd first like to introduce Kimberly Burham and Corinne Hall. So Kimberly Burham is a senior officer on the public sector retirement system team at the Pew Charitable Trust. Currently, her work focuses on revenue projections and the economic outlook. Prior to joining Pew, Kimberly held positions with Penn Wharton Budget Model, the Investment Company Institute, and the Social Security Administration. She received her PhD in economics from the University of Notre Dame and her BA in political science and economics from Hastings College. She'll be joined by Corinne Hall, and she is a state policy officer on Pew's Public Sector Retirement System project. Corinne oversees the team's new engagement strategy and manages technical assistance to policymakers at the invitation of cities and states across the country. The team applies objective and data-driven processes to analyze public retirement systems and to assist officials in developing and examine options to ensure that their public sector retirement systems are affordable and sustainable, and that they put workers on the path to a secure retirement. Prior to retirement at Pew, Corinne spent 10 years as a financial advisor, working primarily in the public sector space. Most recently, she works with Nationwide Retirement Solutions, serving plan sponsors, elected officials, and municipal and county employees. With that said, I'm going to turn the program over to Kimberly and Corinne. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Representative Tobash. My name is Corinne Hall, and I work, like you said, with Pew at the Public Sector Retirement Project, otherwise known as the Pensions Team. I'm co-presenting with my colleague, Kimberly Burham. We're going to be talking about COVID-19 related recession as well as stress testing during a downturn. For those of you unfamiliar with our work in pensions, our role is one of research and support to the states. Kimberly is not an actuary, and I am not a legislator, but NCSL kind of covered our bases by having one of each on the phone today. We're going to cover three topic areas: the impacts of COVID-19 on the national economy and state finances, state responses to it, and a legislative update. And we're also going to be talking about implementing and using stress testing during an economic downturn. Now I'm going to turn it over to Kimberly to discuss the pandemic-related recession. Kimberly?
Thanks, Corinne. So I'm just going to jump right in. According to the latest projections from the Congressional Budget Office, the pandemic will cause GDP to be about 6% lower in 2021 than it would have been otherwise. But you'll see on this graph here that GDP is expected to recover steadily to previous growth rates in the long run. And that orange line there is the new reality facing state budgets and pension plans. At the same time, there's a lot of uncertainty out there, depending on the timing of a vaccine, a second wave of the pandemic, how fast employment recovers. And we're also looking at one scenario from the Federal Reserve that characterizes a double dip recession and a slower return to long-run growth rates. So although both of these scenarios return to long-run growth rates, in the long run, the economy is smaller than it would have been. And, for pension stress testing and revenue projections, we use the CBO baseline as the new reality. And then we're also looking at the Fed scenario that just shows a little bit longer lasting recession. So what does that mean for states? So here we can see the impact of the shuttering of the economy. And Pew has examined state-provided revenue projections for 2020 and 2021. On average, states are anticipating a 7% drop in revenue compared to their pre-COVID expectations in 2020 and a 10% in 2021. So in the short run, that lower than expected revenue means that state legislators will need to make difficult choices. And we've already seen pressure on making pension contributions. When Pew projects own state revenue, we use state-provided projections in the near term to provide information about the portion of state revenue that goes to pension costs. So, secondly, I want to talk about how do we put this in context? And we all remember the Great Recession, most of us. Although this pandemic recession is much deeper, it's also expected to be shorter lived, and that means revenue is not expected to decline by quite as much. And in the medium run, there's going to be a lower hit to GDP. So that can just help us sort of put these two crises that a lot of us have seen both of into perspective. So let's shift from talking about budgets to pension systems. And what we really see is a high degree of volatility. And for me, this picture really encapsulates the whipsaw nature of the COVID downturn. And here we see that even though there's been a 35% drop in the S&P, that by the end of June, markets had nearly recouped those losses. And that's really important because as a result, most pension funds were able to generate positive returns, about 3% on average. Although that's a lot lower than they had maybe expected for this year. And this shows how this high level of uncertainty has impacted volatility in the markets. And that really highlights the importance of stress testing. I'll also note that our updated downside scenario includes a 20% asset shock on stocks as part of the downside. So I'd also like to talk about what's happening to fixed income assets. So currently, interest rates are lower than ever before. And you can see this by looking at the difference between the dotted and solid gray lines and the dotted and solid blue lines. And when we're developing our long-run core bond projections, we assume a 10-year transition from the current Treasury yield to the CBO's projected rate. So the question is, bottom line, what does this mean for our average annual core bond return? And even though in the long run, core bond returns go back to normal, as a result of the low current yields, average annual core bond returns are lower than before COVID-19 induced recession. So Pew projects that average annual core bond returns over the next 20 years will be 2.5%, compared to our previous expectation of 3.6%. And that means we have to update our expectations for lower portfolio returns overall, and that's just core bonds are around 23% of the average public pension portfolio, so that's a significant amount of that. And the returns have a big impact. So based on an average pension plan portfolio, we think that the average annual return is going to shift down to 6% from our previous expectations of 6.4. And that downward expectation for return means that long-run pension health is gloomier, and decisions made on funding now are likely going to matter for the long run. And then finally, just really quick, I'm going to just show you that all these projections are based on this detailed analysis. We take in information from a number of sources, and we project what different asset classes are going to do in each and every year for the next 20 or 30 years. And mainly I'm just showing this to you so you can have it as a resource if you're interested, and you can refer to it if you have questions. And on that note, I'm going to turn it back to my colleague Corinne, who is going to talk about how states are responding to these new economic realities and the role of stress testing.
Thank you, Kimberly. We all know that 2020 has been quite a year. There have been many questions that states, plan sponsors, fiduciaries tend to ask my colleagues or myself during a downturn. And the majority of them boil down to one question, which is, what do I do? And the answer to that question more often than not is one that nobody really likes to hear, which is, it depends. The past months, we've seen borrowing to address gaps in revenue. We've seen this in Illinois and New Jersey. Several states are having conversations or have decided to reduce or change their 2021 pension contributions. Some states will lean into cost-sharing provisions to help mitigate risk. Some states will create budget breathing room by making some changes to their assumed rates of return. What I'm hoping to convey to you is an understanding that all states are different, and there are multiple options for managing a response to a downturn. And while the solutions may vary, the one key constant of managing a crisis is having the right information at hand when you need it. So the map you see in front of you is illustrating which states have considered or have passed stress testing requirements. So the blue is showing you who has passed it, yellow where it is under consideration. Just some call outs here. New Jersey, for example, adopted stress testing in 2019. We had included at Pew New Jersey stress test in a paper we did with the Harvard Kennedy School in 2018. That report was highlighted the critical need the state had to stick to a certain number of pension increases in contribution no matter what. And over the past 6 months, New Jersey went through a lengthy consideration process, ultimately deciding to make their pension payment and make it at the amount they planned on prior to the pandemic. Last month, policymakers adopted a budget which included the state's largest pension contribution in state history, even while facing the revenue declines. North Carolina, another example here, they recently, this summer, in fact, cemented stress testing as with legislation. To provide some history, in 2018, an analysis showed that the state's high contribution levels and funded ratio would protect the system from significant cost increases in the event of a market downturn, and that plan decreases to the discount rate could be made without negatively impacting costs. Both states, very different situations, very different choices on the table. In both cases, the decisions were informed by the reporting they had in hand. I wanted to show you kind of a bit of a breakdown to give you a different look of what was happening in the states in regard to stress test reporting. And you can see on this, and I won't go into it in great detail, but you can see the who, when they implemented it with legislation and how often. Most importantly, I want to call out that, the states require their reporting, most of them, to do some type of simulation for a downturn, which meant they had that information in hand as things were unfolding this past year. And a couple call outs. Colorado is an interesting case. as they passed their stress testing requirement in 2018. And they used it kind of as a scorecard of sorts for reforms they had made post doing some reporting in the state in 2015. That report in 2015 showed that they had a 1 in 4 chance of insolvency under the existing policy. This finding allowed for subsequent reforms to increase employer contributions and employee contributions, reducing some benefits, and created some policies to automatically respond to the next downturn. Connecticut is another example. That state did their first report in 2018, and it was shared broadly, including by the state's budget office. That report was directly cited by the administration at that time for informing the conversation surrounding the need for additional reforms in the state. And generally, these reports are done annually, and I think in terms of like specifics, there's a little bit of dealer's choice. There's some elements there. I would imagine Joe would be a much better resource than I to speak about that. And in terms of how the data gets from an actuary and turned into budget process, Pennsylvania does this unbelievably well. So I think that that Representative Tobash is uniquely poised to speak very well about that. In terms of the target audience for these, at the end of the day, there is a bit of a gap between the demands and information for elected officials who are accountable to taxpayers and the fiduciaries who are accountable to the beneficiaries of the plan. A good stress test report is going to bridge that gap. These types of analyses are often done by the plans, but are not usually made accessible to budget officers or decision makers representing the plan sponsor. A key focus of our work is leveraging the pension stress testing to inform plan sponsors, including legislators and state budget officials, so the data can be incorporated into the budgetary process. And before I wrap up, I just want to quickly thank you for taking the time today and remind you that if you have questions or you saw something today that you feel would help or benefit your state, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. And I will leave you with a couple closing thoughts before handing it back to Kimberly for hers. And I would say the biggest things to remember is that stress test is not an academic exercise. It is being used on the ground to make decisions every day. And in terms of establishing a standard process, target the plan sponsor. That's going to help inform long-term budget planning, and as well as, you know, a standard report being tailored to individual circumstances. And I gave you a few examples of how that was being done. Kimberly?
Thanks, Corinne. So I think what I kind of want to bring home is that the, reductions to revenue expectations are going to provide short-run stress for states and pensions. And meanwhile, the reduction in long-run expected returns is going to provide a long-run stress that, legislators need to consider and be aware of. And finally, stress testing can help prepare for a possible double-dip recession scenario, in addition to the current stress that we're under. Corinne, do you have any thoughts?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
So,
Okay.
Kimberly and Corinne from the Pew Charitable Trust, they truly have a level of expertise. The Pew Trust has been in Pennsylvania to help lawmakers here for over the last number of years implement some pretty substantial pension reform, and we certainly appreciate their sponsorship and their partnership here with NCSL. And now we want to move on to an actuary, Joe Newton. Joe Newton's a nationally recognized public sector actuary who works with numerous statewide, regional, and local retirement systems, and he's located in GRS's Dallas, Texas office. He's got more than 20 years of actuarial and benefit consulting experience. Joe's clients are located in Colorado, Hawaii, Rhode Island, South Carolina, Kentucky, and Texas. Joe is the pension market leader for GRS. In his capacity, Joe functions in one of the most senior professional roles in the organization, providing significant firm-wide leadership and contribution at the highest levels. The role bridges the gap between industry requirements, internal processes, and client deliverables to further strengthen GRS's position in the market. Joe was also recently appointed to the Associate Advisory Committee of the National Association of State Retirement Administrators, where he provides support and vital initiatives to support public employee benefit programs across the country. With that said, we had a nice conversation yesterday. Joe, I'm sure everyone on the call is going to be interested to hear what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Tobash. And I'm glad you added that last part, because anytime you say the actuary is fixing to speak, interest is not necessarily what everyone's thinking about. But yeah, I'm glad to be a part of this group, and really want to start with my first slides about decision making, which falls right up from what the Pew Group was talking about. That all of this information needs to be focused on and about decision making, and that's anything you're getting from your actuary needs to be about decision making. If it's the Val report, if it's a legislative analysis, and if it's a stress test, it's all about making a current decision, confirming past decisions, etc. And that's a lot of times there's a lot of academically interesting metrics that come out of the information, but if it's not really helping you make a decision, it actually can be a distraction. So so make sure we're focusing on the given decision here. And so to think about a stress test, you know, sometimes pension funding is such an abstract concept. You're thinking about all these different scenarios here to show up. One way I kind of try to apply it is think about car crashes. You know, there's engineers at car companies when they're making these cars and they're trying to test the seat belts, and they take the cars and they're crashing them on purpose. Perfectly good cars would run just fine if left alone, but you know they're simulating these crashes, and they don't just roll them up against the wall and barely bump it, you know, and they don't just obliterate it where there's nothing left to even test either. What they're going to want to do is be right at the point where impact is happening, where data is helpful in improving the situation. Okay, so they want to know, okay, at 55 miles an hour, yeah, this worked. We saved the lives. But at 60 miles an hour, this structure will not work. This will not get. So what improvements can we make to get that little bit of improvement and keep going and keep going? And then there's one thing that also to learn is there a speed that you actually can't protect yourself from? And so, you know, sometimes there's just limits, and those are good things to understand, and that way you can move forward with the car crash in our car safety system. And how that's going to apply here with pension systems, that's what stress tests are, is you're putting stress into the situation in different ways, and you want to be right where you're learning as much as you can about what the pension system and the stakeholders can accept and handle. And I know with stress testing first started showing up, clients are really asking why do they want to do this, what all they're going to want to do is make the plan look bad. They're going to run it through these really bad scenarios that'll never happen, and just create, you know, that way everyone gets more and more ammunition to close the plans. You know, likewise, the other way, you know, sometimes there's pushback. Well, the system shouldn't be in control of the stress test because all they're going to do is use scenarios that are too easy and don't cause enough stress and make them look better than they really are. You know, none of that's really happening as far as I can tell. And that's not the purpose. If there's not at least one scenario on the stress test that's truly stressing it, then it's really not an exercise worth doing. You know, you need to be right where you are truly stressing it, and to focus not on the outcome of the individual scenario, because the likelihood of that one scenario occurring in real life is, you know, almost infinitely zero. What we're looking at is how are your policies reacting? What decisions can we make? What are the improvements based on the outcomes? Not necessarily that one outcome, how you did, or, you know, whether you passed or failed. And that gets back to the decision-making test. The other thing stress tests let you do, kind of another analogy here, is sports teams in practices or scrimmage. The sports teams, the football team doesn't just show up on Sunday and play. They play all week. They're putting themselves in situations to have to work through a problem, work together, find out how to do it better. They're preparing for the live situation, and that way when the live situation shows up, a lot of the improvements have already been put in place. They're ready to react. And so pension systems, that's what stress tests should look like. Okay, we're going to put ourselves in a simulated stress environment. How are we going to react? What do our policies react? How do our investment policies react? And even think about, how are our stakeholders? It's not, I've never seen people do it, but it'd be an idea to bring your communications team in. Okay, if this is happening, how would we even respond? And then back up to that. Okay, well, what kind of communications can we be putting out now that will make that easier when that recession shows up? Because one thing we do know, there will be a recession at some point. None of this goes in a straight line. It's all cyclical. And so now we're going to talk a little bit about how clients are currently responding, or the types of questions we're getting. One of the things we're really getting a lot of is what happens if they undercontribute? What happens if we don't meet the full arc? What happens if we take a whole contribution holiday? What happens if our population counts down? In a lot of cases, the revenue stream is tied directly to the total payroll. And so these are the types of questions we're getting, and pretty much universally the answer is, well, if you reduce contributions now, you're just going to exacerbate whatever problem you think you're dealing with now. You're just going to compound that and make that significantly worse in the future. Contributions are the lifeblood of a pension system. It's a financing arrangement. It is a cash flow model. And similar to your body needing food and water to exist, you can take a perfectly healthy person, stop giving them food and water, they're not going to live very long. The same thing with pension systems. If you shut off the revenue stream, that it's not going to be able to handle it. You can't expect the investments to just immediately react and help make up that gap. And so one thing to think about as you're asking questions, well, what if we decide to put in less money next year? Is immediately, what is the plan to get back on track? How are we going to get that money back going? So one thing to think about is economic cycles. Since World War II, the average cycle expansion has been about 65 months. And the average contraction then lasts about 11. So in total, you're talking trough to trough, recession to recession, 6.5 years or so. Okay. So kind of think about that as, if you're setting the budget and you're thinking, how often am I going to have to deal with a downturn of some kind? Well, about 6 to 7 years, you're going to be dealing with one. Well, in the pension world, a lot of times what happens is whatever underfunding you get in a given year is then spread out and paid off over the next 20 to 30 years. So you're taking dollars that we're supposed to put in now and then setting up some sort of payoff financing schedule to pay it off over the next 20 to 30 years. Well, what we just said about those recessions coming every 7 years is meaning about 20 years from now, that group of stakeholders is going to have to be dealing with 3 or 4 stacks of previous contribution deficits, and they're having to deal with it all at the same time. And this creates a downward spiral. And so what we would rather see is we would rather not see the contribution holiday taken at all. But if it is, there should be some sort of financing mechanism to deal with that before the next recession. So we're looking at, maybe a 5-year period at the longest to pay for that. In addition, contributions being reduced at the downturn of the market really hinders just asset accumulation in general, which is what we're trying to do. We're trying to accumulate as much assets as we can. Think about dollar cost averaging. If dealing with your own financial advisor or something, they're like, look, put in the same amount every month because we don't know if next month is high or low, and we want to make sure we're getting those buys at the bottom end to really change your amount of assets you're accumulating over time. So let's look at that in a real life example. This is an actual pension plan history for 20 years from 1997 to 2017. The dark blue line is the actual market value that pension plan had every valuation year. And so you can see the tech bubble, and then it comes down, and then you can see it, recovered to some extent before the 2008, and then we've had a really kind of a takeoff since. In this case, the dotted line is net cash outflows, and so as a percentage of that asset base. And so what that means is how much money is leaving the trust net of any money you're getting. So let's say you have $100 in assets, you're paying out $10 total of benefits every year. You're collecting, say, $6 in contribution, so the net would be 4. And so that's what this dotted line represents, is a -4. And you can see it spikes down, meaning you're paying a lot more out. In this case, they were during the downturns on the market, which basically creates a net seller at the bottom of the market. Now that money's not around, it's not there to ride up the good times at the end, and it's going to have a huge impact on how much money you end up with at the end. So what are some ways to try to deal with that? We're going to do a little case study where, in this case, $100 million is proposed to be put in 2003 recession, and then they do it again in the 2008 recession. So they come in and say, well, we're supposed to put in whatever we're supposed to put in. We're going to put in $100 million less in 2003 and 2008. And so, of course, there's always the question, what's the cost of doing this? What's the budget impact? And unfortunately, the question that's not always asked is, okay, what are the best ways to finance this? Because somebody's going to have to make this up at some point. And I think, in general, using normal returns, meaning if you just assume your investment return assumption is going to be true every year going forward, you're probably underestimating the total cost of this contribution relief. So I kind of came up with 5 ways that I could see this being done. The first is to make contributions as scheduled. So just how about not skipping it? That'd be a good one. But even if you, then the second one is, well, if you have to, we're going to take out a loan. We're going to go get a bond, a 5-year bond at 3% interest, and go ahead and make the pension plan whole, so that the pension plan is getting its cash flow, and then the state will make up the contributions on the outside. The third one down is, we're going to miss the contribution, but we're going to increase our contributions for the next 5 years to the pension plan to make up the difference. Then the fourth one is probably the most normal one, which is we're going to miss the contribution, but then we're going to do a 20-year payoff. And then the last one, unfortunately, there's plenty of states that do this. We're just going to miss the contribution, and we're going to not really do anything about it. We're not going to increase contributions later and make up the difference. And so here on this graph, in dollar amounts, I've put them, the light yellow is total dollars difference of contributions. And so the first column there is 0 in both. Your contributions aren't changing. You don't have an unfunded liability either. The second one is saying, well, okay, because of the interest on that bond, we had to pay $18 million more into the trust fund, but we actually didn't. We didn't generate any more unfunded liability. The third one, we actually now have to contribute $44 million more because we're paying a higher interest. We're paying whatever the investment return assumption is into the pension fund. But also, because that money wasn't around to generate earnings, we've generated $113 million unfunded liability at the same time. So we've put in more and are further behind. The next one over is we did that over a 20-year period. And you can see that we're just going up the ladder. We're now paying more and having more unfunded by the time we're done. And then the last one, unfortunately, is almost catastrophic. And that's, we didn't put in the $200 million. And now in 2019, so 15 years later in general, we have created a $770 million unfunded liability because of that $200 million way back when. So you can see clearly, hopefully the last one's just off the table completely. But really, the second or the third one, if the first one's not an option, and that's the one we'd always recommend, it would be something closer to 2 or 3 there to try to keep the pension fund from just getting further and further behind. And so due to time, I'm going to go ahead and jump to the end here and say, information to be learned from stress tests. Focus should be on decision-making, constructive observations, not this one scenario, because a lot of times we get asked, why are they asking for that one scenario? It's like, well, it's not really the point. This is just an adverse experience scenario. How are the policies working? How are assumptions working? Why do we have different assumptions than our peers? And how is this going to change over time? And then really all gets back to how can we improve our processes and our policies to make up that difference. So now we'll pass it back to Representative Tobash.
Thank you so much, Joe. And there's so much information here. And gosh, I serve on the State Employees Retirement System SERS. We have 2 in the state of Pennsylvania. But Kimberly, Corinne, and Joe have really brought home a lot of great points. I'll tell you just briefly about the process. I mentioned at the beginning of this call where we started in 2000, and I talk about this being a problem not about today. What about tomorrow? This is a what about tomorrow scenario. So in 20 years ago, we were 116% funded. Now we're the 42nd worst state in the nation as far as funding goes, about 55% funded. And largely as a result of some of the things that have been talked about with our previous speakers. The fact that we retroactively increased benefits when we had overfunding was really the beginning of an avalanche. But after that, as Joe mentioned, the state's unwillingness to make the annual required contribution over a long period of time caused us to get in this scenario. So when I'm talking to people, I talk about the average contribution an employer makes to the retirement benefits of their employees in the United States, which is just a little bit less than 4%. So some employers don't have a plan, and many are contributing more than 4%. But right around that 4% number. Today in Pennsylvania, our contribution rate, because we're trying to catch up on this debt, is 34% of payroll. 34% of payroll. Our pension costs are about 10% of a $30 billion budget, and it has grown exponentially. So, the idea that we are talking about what many of our colleagues don't consider when they talk about financial responsibility, and that is what about tomorrow and really understanding the risks behind the budget. I'll just go on to a couple of things on stress testing. Stress testing simply, measures the financial impact of moderate to severe adverse experience, and therefore enables more informed planning and decision making to mitigate that risk. The saying is that hindsight is 20/20, and if they would have known where we'd be right now in 2000, would we be there today in Pennsylvania? But I can tell you this, when you ask, would Pennsylvania lawmakers have reacted differently if they would have had a crystal ball? You can have a crystal ball. The crystal ball is stress testing. You can take a look at it, and you can be thoughtful about some of the stuff that we are faced with right now with the market conditions of the pandemic. And you can also understand what Joe was talking about. When you take a look at cyclical markets, it's not, it's kind of 7 years from trough to trough. And if you are not investing in your pension systems in times when it's difficult to make the payments, you're probably doing exactly what's wrong. Dollar cost averaging says, buy low or buy at a fair price because you're consistently making those payments. So it can be really problematic. And as I mentioned, a 34.5% contribution rate, 34.5% of payroll, is oppressive in the state of Pennsylvania to do the other things that we need to fund, roads and bridges and all of the social benefits that we've got and people are expecting us to make. What happened when we changed our benefit design, it was we were looking for more savings, and we talked about earlier about the act and the formation of the commission that I was fortunate enough to chair. And a number of initiatives came out of there. But on the stress testing part, I would tell you if I broke it down in just a couple of simple things that you should be doing when you're trying to enact this type of legislation or bring it into your state. Number one, it should be consistent and it should be frequent. The commission report said you should be doing a stress testing measure on an annual basis. The outcome should be measured against other real-world things, like the future contribution rate or the current budget or the future commitments that your state has. It should be transparent. You should not only share it with the administration and with lawmakers, but we believe, and the commission report said, that it should be shared with the general public to take a look so you understand how bad things can be. It should be simple. So, when you take a look at these actuarial reports, there's so many different metrics. And as Joe said, you really want to put your system under stress. But the fact of the matter is when you deliver it back to a General Assembly that is worried about many, many other things, I think it needs to be very simple. you should use an actuary instead of investment consultants. So these systems have investment consultants, and they want to, shed some favorable outlooks on the future. And Joe mentioned that it doesn't often happen that those outlooks are not accurate. But I can tell you that with actuarial science, the outcomes that you see will be more accurate, I believe, than if you're using an investment consultant. And the outcomes should be, we should take a look at them, and the undesirable results that might take place. So the Act 5 Commission had a number of pieces of legislation that came out of it. In Pennsylvania, as I mentioned before, we have two systems, the teacher system and the other state employees. And we believe that we can develop savings by consolidating those systems. We established a common reporting period. So CSRS is on a calendar year and PSERS is on a fiscal year, and we couldn't even compare our two systems against each other very accurately, much less other high-performing systems without the United States. So I think that comparison is important, and we've gone about doing that. We do have a stress testing bill that we are expecting to pass the Senate and become law in this session. We took some language out of our law that allowed us to collar or to put caps on the contribution rate. As I mentioned back in 2001, they said, well, the market had done really well, and we know that there's a recession. We know that things are poor, but it's going to bounce back. So let's not put any more than a 1.5% increase into our contributions. And that was actually and absolutely the wrong thing to do, and we took that language out of the law. We also have an element of transparency that we want to bring into the fold here. We believe, and the commission believed, and the testifiers believed, that more transparency is absolutely a better thing. And the last thing, my colleague and friend Frank Ryan, he's got a piece of legislation that would establish an independent audit committee. And again, we think that is extremely important moving forward, that audit should be done by independent outside third parties to make sure that you are getting the proper information. So with that said, we want to take some time right now, and we want to make sure that we're able to answer some questions from the audience. I am going to start out with one question right here, if that is okay, and I think we will. I just have a second. So I'm encouraging, the chat option exists right now, so anyone from the audience, if you would like to ask a question of our presenters, we got them on the line, and we think and we want to take time to make sure that we're utilizing their expertise as we move forward. So one question I have for Kimberly, and we talk about the current COVID circumstances that we're in right now. What do you think the pension contribution outlook is in the short term, just over the next couple of years, like in 2022 and 2023? Kimberly, can you weigh in on that?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think we've been hearing from many states that they're exploring making changes to contributions. And I think that when you look at this right now, where you have this current budgetary stress in the short run, there's going to be a lot of states asking those questions, how can I afford this? But I think, Joe and you both made some good thoughts about the long run. That's going to have long-term consequences. And of course, since we're also seeing that there's going to be lower expected returns, that means that, legislators are going to have to consider making adjustments to contributions or benefits in order to meet their obligations in the long run. And there's certainly a lot of plans where contributions are directly tied to funding goals that are going to be affected by lower returns in the long run.
there's no question that we're in a cycle that is going to be very concerning and put a lot of pressure on different state budgets, and the outlook today doesn't look great. Corinne, you noted that 11 states have enacted stress testing requirements through legislation. What are the advantages of having this practice in as a statutory requirement?
Sure. And I can talk about the benefits of having strong process and making it something that's repeatable and practice and making sure that it's efficient. But the reality is that when you do something year over year, it just likens the chance that you will use it for when you need it. And I think that's really the most important thing. I think the other thing is that the analysis then becomes more likely to be shared to the right audience. Oftentimes in Pennsylvania, you know this far better than I do, that Pennsylvania is a great example. You have two systems that you said yourself couldn't compare the two. There was a time, right? Because in many ways, stress tests can, for people who haven't looked at them, it's kind of like a financial statement, right? There's a lot of ways to do it. So when you make it systematic, it just means that you're getting something that will be user-friendly, hit the right notes, and be shared with the right audience at the right time.
Well, those are great comments, Corinne.
If you don't mind, I'd like to add to that. I think that was a great answer. And what I've found is by doing them regularly, you can actually use the trend of the outcomes from your stress tests as part of your communications and monitoring as well. It's the trends in a lot of this data is more important than where you are in a specific point in time. If you say, well, I have an 82% funded ratio, that's not very meaningful, really. Because if I had a situation where your funding ratio 10 years ago was 72 and now it's 82, versus a situation where 10 years ago it was 92 and now it's 82, well, so that's two very different situations. And so the trends, I think, and I like the trends of even projections, so you can overlap that. It would be a reason to do it regularly, so that you can monitor how the trend is even changing. So.
Joe, you make great points. Here's a question: Can someone review the factors that should govern decisions on whether or not to lower the expected rates of return? I can tell you that in Pennsylvania, our surge system, we lowered it by 1/8 of a point over the last year 2 times. So we lowered it 1/4 of a point. We're currently at 7%, which is kind of in the pack with other pension plans throughout the United States, maybe even a little bit on the lower end of the spectrum, but many of my colleagues, and myself included, think the 7% is still a pretty aggressive goal at this point in time. Can anybody weigh in on that?
Well, there's 2 pieces of at least 2 pieces of that process. One is what you're assuming reasonable in the first place, or is it appropriate in the first place? And that's going to be very data driven, or should be, and it needs to be forward looking. The information provided by Kimberly and her group earlier with the interest rate differences, and you take that as a building block and begin to look at, well, what's a reasonable thing to assume going forward? It's not what you can do, it's what's reasonable, what's prudent to be doing here. So that's kind of step one. You have to make sure you're not outside of any bounds. But then there is a line at some point. It becomes policy. It becomes, okay, what's the best positioning ourselves for the future, in combination with all of our other policies that are coming along with this decision. And so I think it's important to look at that as well, from almost like a risk-reward relationship. Again, once you've defined the area you can work within, okay, now how am I going to make the right decision in that circle?
And there's no question that when you sit on these boards, that you've got the fiduciary responsibility of the participants in the plan, but there's also pressure from legislatures not to lower that discount rate too low, because it does put immediate budgetary pressure on the process. Kimberly, do you have anything else, or Corinne, anything to weigh in on as far as discount rates go?
I'd agree with that. I think when we're sort of developing our assumptions, it's really, really data driven. You know, we're looking at sort of the standard bearers of projections with the CBO and the Federal Reserve, and just looking at what's actually happening in markets today, because you got to start with where you are to get to where you think you might be in the long run. And of course, as you mentioned, there's policy decisions that need to be made, need to be considered as well. But yeah, for us, it's mainly just completely looking at the data and consulting with other groups and looking at what they're doing too, so that we sort of are making sure we're staying within the general expected bounds.
Excellent. Joe, I think there's time for one final question. How can stress testing be used to help develop dynamic plan provisions, both for risk management and to ensure the value of the benefits to the members? Can you provide any examples?
Yeah, I think the stress test or using some sort of scenario testing is going to be the only way to truly show the power of benefits that are dynamic. And if you just use a deterministic projection, a lot of time you're not going to see the difference between having the dynamic versus not as part of the structure. So you have to show the scenario so that you can see the liability side changing as well. And again, you're comparing back to baseline. And so we have several systems that have some level of dynamic benefit provision, whether it's a COLA, whether it's say an interest credit on a cash balance plan. There's some different things there, and it's light and day in stress testing when the liability can provide some of the relief. And I think there's definitely good ways to fair ways to do that, and there's unfair ways to do that. And so I think there's lots of discussions on what's the best ways and what's fair to the member in those situations. But if we're just looking at what's the most sustainable, truly sustainable from all aspects, those types of provisions really change the game, and stress testing is one of the biggest, strongest tools to be able to show that impact.
Great, Joe. Thank you so much. So we've done it here. We've gone for 1 hour stress testing from door to door. I just really want to thank Joe, and I want to thank Corinne and Kimberly. I also want to give a shout out to Anna Petrini from NCSL, who was really helpful in putting everything together and keeping us on track. That brings us to the conclusion of this webinar. If you have any questions following this event, please feel free to contact NCSL and Pew staff at the email addresses shown. This webinar is being recorded and will be archived on the NCSL website. I want to say a big thanks to all of the speakers for taking time out of their busy schedules to share their knowledge and experience with us today. And please tune in for a second fall fiscal webinar on what the federal stimulus means to the states on Thursday, October 2nd. Thank everyone again, and be well and be safe out there.